An 18-year-old football player left for a 4th of July boat trip with his closest friends. Hours later, he vanished without a trace. 2 days afterward, his body was found floating near a deserted island. But the biggest mystery wasn't where Nolan Wells was found. It was why the stories told by the people who were with him didn't match. One missing phone, conflicting eyewitness accounts, a family demanding answers. Was this a tragic accident, or is someone hiding the truth? This is the death of Nolan Xavier Wells.
If you're new here, welcome to Cold Case Files 365. We don't do speculation for the sake of clicks. We lay out what's confirmed, what's disputed, and what's still an open question so you can draw your own conclusions with the facts actually in front of you. Hit subscribe now because we're going to be tracking this case as it develops and you don't want to miss the moment it breaks. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. I read every single one and it helps this channel more than you'd think. Let's start with who Nolan Wells was, because before he was a headline, he was a kid with a future in front of him. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old, a wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College, and a graduate of Ocean Springs High School. He was gearing up to return to campus for the coming football season. He would have turned 19 the following month. Those who knew him describe a young man with a big heart, a gifted athlete, and, by his parents' account, a gentle, warm presence who looked out for his younger siblings. Friends who spent that final holiday weekend with him describe someone effortless to be around, the kind of person you automatically felt comfortable talking to. On the afternoon of Saturday, the 4th of July, Wells joined a group of friends for a boat trip out to Horn Island, a barrier island roughly 10 miles off the coast of Mississippi. To understand why this case has as many open questions as it does, you have to understand the place itself. Horn Island is not a tourist destination in the way most people picture the Gulf Coast. It's a federally protected wilderness area, part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore, and it's only reachable by boat. There's no bridge, no ferry schedule, no commercial development, no restaurants, no hotel, no cell towers reliably reaching the interior of the island. It's roughly 14 miles long, shaped by shifting sand and constant erosion, and it's known among locals less as a party destination and more as a quiet, isolated retreat, the kind of place where, once you're there, you're genuinely cut off from the mainland until somebody comes to get you. That isolation matters because it means whatever happened to Nolan Wells that afternoon happened somewhere without security cameras, without easy cell service, and without any witnesses beyond the people who were physically there. Whatever the truth turns out to be, it lives entirely inside the memories and the phones of a small group of young people who were on that island together. Witnesses reported Wells was last seen around 3 in the afternoon, wearing blue swim trunks and sunglasses. By that night, he had not returned to the mainland with the rest of the group. One of his friends contacted the Coast Guard around 11 that night. His mother, Christine Wansley, called the sheriff's office as the hours dragged into the next day, desperate for information about where her son was. 2 days later, on the morning of July 6th, searchers found his body in the water just off Horn Island. For a moment, let's step back from the specifics of this case and talk about how an investigation like this actually unfolds, because a lot of the frustration you're about to hear from Nolan's family, and a lot of the criticism aimed at law enforcement, comes down to a mismatch between how people expect investigations to move and how they actually move in real life. Anyone who's spent time around true crime content knows the rhythm we've been trained to expect. A body is found, forensic evidence is collected, and within days, sometimes within the same episode, a clear answer emerges. Cause of death confirmed, timeline established, suspect named or cleared. That is not how real investigations work, and it is almost never how death investigations involving open water work. Toxicology alone can take weeks. A full autopsy report, especially one where the manner of death isn't immediately obvious, can take even longer. When you're dealing with a body recovered from open water after 2 days, there are additional complications. Water immersion affects everything from time of death estimates to the condition of physical evidence on the body itself. Add in the fact that this case involves interviewing dozens of witnesses, examining digital evidence from multiple phones, and coordinating between a county sheriff's office and, as we'll get to, federal law enforcement. And you're looking at a process that unfolds over months, not days. That's the tension sitting underneath this entire case. A family that lost their son is watching the clock, and every day without answers feels like a betrayal. Meanwhile, investigators are trying to do the actual unglamorous work of building a case that can withstand scrutiny, which sometimes means saying frustratingly little in public while the work happens behind the scenes. Sheriff John Ledbetter's early public statement reflected exactly that tension. He told reporters his detectives didn't see obvious signs of foul play, but stressed that the investigation remained active and that his office needed time to be thorough. On its face, that's a reasonable, measured statement, but to a grieving family desperate for someone to be as certain as they need them to be, no obvious signs of foul play can sound a lot like, "We've already decided this was an accident." That gap in interpretation between what law enforcement means and what a family in crisis hears has fueled a significant amount of the public back and forth in this case. Almost immediately after Nolan's body was recovered, his family made clear they were not willing to simply accept the initial read on what happened. They brought in civil rights attorney Ben Crump, a name most people will recognize from a long list of high-profile cases involving questions of race, policing, and accountability. Crump's team arranged for an independent autopsy, separate from the official examination being conducted by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office, where notably results were delayed pending toxicology findings that could take several additional weeks. At a press conference in New York, standing alongside civil rights leader Reverend Al Sharpton and Nolan's parents, Crump laid out what his team considers the central inconsistency in this entire case, and it really does come down to one specific contradiction. The three friends who traveled with Wells to the island say that when the group prepared to leave that afternoon, Wells told them he wanted to stay behind with a young woman he had met there, and that he planned to catch a ride back later on a different boat. But that same young woman has reportedly told investigators a different version, that Wells actually got back on the boat with the group when they left. Sit with that for a second, because it's the single detail this entire case seems to hinge on. Either Wells stayed on the island and something happened to him there afterward, alone or with people who haven't been identified, or he left with his friends and something happened on the way back, or after they returned. Those are two fundamentally different sequences of events, and right now there is no public evidence definitively resolving which one is true. Crump has also pointed to a video that began circulating online, appearing to show a heated argument on the island that day, and he's raised questions about Wells's phone, which was not recovered with his body. Instead, it turned up in the possession of one of the friends who had accompanied him to Horn Island. For a family already reeling from the worst loss imaginable, a missing phone recovered from someone else's hands is not a small detail. It's the kind of thing that, fairly or not, plants a seed of suspicion that's almost impossible to fully uproot. Nolan's mother has said she and her family used the Life 360 tracking app to follow his phone's location after he went missing, and found that his phone had, in fact, been with his friends, not with him. She's also raised the possibility that some text messages may have been deleted, though that claim, like much of what's circulating in this case, remains unverified. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story, because it's about to get more complicated, not less. As public attention on the case intensified, one of Nolan's friends decided to step forward and tell his side directly, on camera, by name. His name is Treseston Shepard, and over the following days he gave interviews to major national outlets addressing the viral video head-on. He said the voice heard yelling in that clip wasn't Nolan at all, it was him. Shepard offered his own account of the timeline, that the group's boat had developed an electrical problem and had to turn back toward the mainland early, and that Nolan chose to stay behind on the island because he'd met someone he wanted to keep talking to. According to Shepard, the plan was for Nolan to get a ride back later on a different friend's boat, a plan that obviously never came together. He also pushed back on a photo that had been circulating online, one that appeared to show Nolan at a pool party in the early hours of July 5th. A detail that, if true, would have meant Nolan made it off the island and into a completely different set of circumstances before he died. Shepard said that photo was actually taken at an earlier, unrelated gathering, days before the holiday weekend in question. On the matter of the missing phone, Shepard and a family member both offered a fairly mundane explanation that it's not unusual for a group heading into the water to leave their phones behind, gathered together on the boat rather than risk losing them or ruining them in the surf. When everyone in a friend group is swimming at the same time, somebody's phone ends up as a communal pile on the dashboard. It's a plausible, ordinary explanation for something that, in isolation, sounds deeply suspicious. Shepard has said that he and the rest of the friend group have received death threats in the weeks since Nolan's death. Not from investigators, not from the family directly, but from strangers online who have already decided, based on partial information and viral clips, exactly what happened and who's to blame. He's said he came forward specifically to push back against what he considers a false narrative, including the suggestion that race played any role in what happened to his friend. That's a claim worth taking seriously enough to actually examine, because it's one of the more difficult and consequential threads running through this entire case. Photos from the trip show Nolan, who is black, surrounded by friends who appear to be white. That single visual detail, more than almost anything else in this case, has fueled a wave of online speculation and, according to multiple national outlets, has stirred up painful and very familiar feelings about race in Mississippi, specifically in the American South more broadly. It's worth pausing here to talk honestly about why a detail like that carries so much weight, even before a single fact about it is confirmed. Mississippi carries a documented history, one that isn't ancient history, one that's within living memory for a lot of families in that state, of black lives being treated as less urgent, less worthy of thorough investigation by local law enforcement and by the broader legal system. That history doesn't prove anything about this specific case, but it explains in a very direct way why a grieving black family in Mississippi would look at an early "no signs of foul play" statement and hear something closer to "this isn't going to be taken seriously," even if that's not remotely what investigators intended. A retired law enforcement voice weighing in on this case put it about as fairly as it can be put. Distrust of local authorities among people of color, particularly in the South, is not an unreasonable position. It doesn't mean this specific sheriff's office is acting in bad faith. It means the family's instinct to bring in independent oversight, their own attorney, their own autopsy, their own investigation running in parallel, is a completely rational response to a historical pattern, regardless of what actually happened to Nolan. At the same time, it's worth being precise about what's actually been alleged here and what hasn't. Nobody in this case, not Crump, not the family, not Shepard, has publicly accused any specific person of committing a crime. What's being disputed is the story itself, whether Nolan stayed on the island or got back in the boat, whether the video shows him in distress or shows something else entirely, whether his separation from his phone is innocent or significant. Race is the backdrop that makes every one of those disputed details land harder and get scrutinized more intensely than it otherwise might. But the actual factual disagreement at the center of this case is about a timeline, about who was where and when, and who's telling the truth about it. Let's talk for a moment about how digital evidence actually factors into a case like this, because it's become one of the more misunderstood parts of modern death investigations. When you have a group of teenagers and young adults spending a day together, especially on a scenic, remote island like Horn Island, there is almost always a substantial amount of unofficial documentation, photos, videos, location data, message threads, scattered across multiple personal devices. Investigators in a case like this aren't just relying on what witnesses say happened. They're pulling data from phones, cross-referencing timestamps, checking geolocation tags on photos and videos, and trying to build an objective timeline that doesn't depend entirely on anyone's memory or motivation to shade the truth in one direction or another. That's part of why the sheriff's office has publicly asked anyone who may have taken photos or video on the northwest tip of Horn Island that day, even material that might seem insignificant, to come forward. In a case with this few confirmed physical witnesses, a stray photo in the background of someone's video showing a clock, a boat, a person in the distance can end up being the piece of evidence that resolves a contested timeline. As of the most recent reporting, investigators have interviewed roughly 60 witnesses, according to the sheriff's office. That includes in-depth interviews with the 3 friends who were on the boat with Nolan. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has also been brought in to help examine the digital evidence collected, an indication that this is being treated with more resources and more scrutiny than a routine drowning case would typically receive. Once the investigation concludes, it will go to the Jackson County District Attorney, who has said the findings will be presented to a grand jury, which will then decide whether any charges are warranted. It's worth explaining briefly what that actually means, because it's a step that gets misunderstood in a lot of true crime coverage. A grand jury isn't a trial. It doesn't determine guilt or innocence. Its job is narrower and more procedural, to review the evidence investigators have gathered and decide whether there's enough to justify formally charging someone with a crime at all. If a grand jury declines to indict, that doesn't necessarily mean nothing happened. It means prosecutors didn't believe they had enough to bring a case that could actually succeed. If it does indict, that's the beginning of a much longer legal process, not the end of one. That's where this case currently sits, in the gap between an active investigation and whatever comes after it. No official cause of death has been publicly announced. No charges have been filed against anyone, and the family's independent investigation, run in parallel with the official one, is still ongoing as well. On July 20th, more than 2 weeks after Nolan went missing, his family and friends gathered at Center Point Church in his hometown of Ocean Springs to say goodbye. Reverend Al Sharpton delivered the eulogy. Mourners described a young man who was a gifted athlete, a devoted older brother, and, by every account offered that day, someone whose absence is going to be felt in ways that go far beyond football. His mother told those gathered simply that they would miss everything about him. Cases like this one tend to follow a familiar shape, even when the underlying facts are completely unique. There's an initial wave of coverage driven by shock and grief, then a second wave driven by a specific piece of evidence, a video, a photo, a missing phone, that seems to demand an explanation. Then competing narratives emerge, each side certain the other is either lying or being unfairly accused. And then, almost always, a long, quiet stretch where the actual investigative work happens. Largely out of public view, while online speculation continues to fill the silence with theories that may or may not have anything to do with what investigators are actually finding, we've covered enough cases on this channel to know that the loudest theory online in the first 2 weeks is rarely the one that ends up matching the final confirmed account. That's not a criticism of anyone following this story closely. It's just a pattern worth keeping in mind as new details continue to surface here. What we can say with confidence, based on everything that's been publicly confirmed so far, is this. Nolan Wells went out on the water with a group of friends on a holiday afternoon. Somewhere between that afternoon and the following Monday morning, he died. The people who were with him that day disagree, at least in the public accounts we have, about exactly when and how he became separated from the group. His phone ended up somewhere other than with him. A video exists that some people believe shows him in distress, and at least one person present says that's a misreading of what's actually on the recording. And a family that loved him is now fighting, publicly and exhaustively, for an investigation they can trust, while the friends who were with him in his final hours say they're being unfairly cast as villains in a tragedy none of them wanted any part of. Both of those things can be true at once. A family can be right to demand transparency, and a group of grieving friends can also be telling the truth about what they saw. The entire point of an investigation, the slow, frustrating, unglamorous kind that takes weeks and months instead of a single news cycle, is to figure out which version or which combination of both versions actually holds up. We'll be watching this case closely. When there's a real update, a toxicology result, a charging decision, Anything beyond another round of speculation, we'll bring it to you, laid out the same way we've laid out everything today: what's confirmed, what's disputed, and what's still genuinely unknown. If this story affected you the way it affected all of us putting it together, do us one favor before you go. Like this video, so it reaches more people following this case honestly instead of chasing rumors. Drop a comment with your take on where the truth actually sits between these two accounts. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Cold Case Files 365, because we'll be back with the next update on Nolan Wells the moment there's something real to report. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.